My passion for dogs started when I was very little. I started with rescues through a shelter. I became a foster home first. Then I joined the rescue group, and after that, while I was studying, I became a mother. Nursing mother. At one point in my life, I considered studying veterinary medicine until a few years later, I got hit with a brutal illness that changed everything. So that was stuck there because I didn't see it as viable. And now I dedicate my life to what I like most. It's about the dogs, both. Rescuing them like I've always done, and taking care of them and finding them a good family.
There's a moment in my life when I decide to adopt. And I think what happened to me happens to a lot of people. It overwhelmed me. And after experiencing very little with the currents that were on the table, I quickly realized that they all talked about behavior. They all talked about waging, but none of them talked about well-being. But what I was really interested in was making sure my dog was as well as possible. So I decided to step back and not get influenced, so I could come to my own conclusions, and then compare them with what was out there. From that moment on, I dedicated all my time to trying to understand, to observe, to analyze critically everything I saw. And I started going to one of the biggest dog parks in Spain, where, at that time, there was a tacit agreement between the police and the people who went to the park, and a lot of people would go with their dogs off leash. Here, the dog park became a source of information and experience that has been vital for my development, later as a demolisher. When Mari and I decided to move in together, we decided to settle down in one place because until then we were living with 9 dogs. 9 dogs, 2 cities, to move in together, and we decided to settle down in one place because until then we were living with 9 dogs. 9 dogs, 2 cities, but we decided to stay here, and we got land for dogs. We wanted a place for a Ganino park with dogs. We decided to build facilities.
We wanted a place to bring our dogs and create Ganino Park. They could roam free, and we could work with them. We built facilities to leave them and spend the day. We also considered making more for rescues, fostering, or any dog in need. So we could leave them there, so we could spend the day here. And we thought about making a few more for any potential rescues, for any possible fostering, or for any dog that might need it. And from there, it went to having all the kennels filled with rescues, to the point where we had to keep expanding more and more. Once you have a place, and dedicate your life to rescuing dogs, it's hard to refuse a dog in need. We kept growing without social media, just by helping local dogs and those from other organizations, including difficult cases.
We also started taking in dogs from other organizations. Difficult ones in the red zone or complicated cases, to work with them and make it easier. The adoptions. And one of the things we were absolutely clear about was that our shelter was our home, so we didn't have to do things the way everyone else did, like it was done before. So, what we did was an exercise to try to sketch out our ideal scenario and then make decisions. To try to get there, nobody was forcing us to take this on, the shelter. Nobody was making us dedicate our lives, our time, our resources to help as many dogs as possible. And if it was our responsibility, we were the ones who had to be able to finance the decision we were making, because in a very short time we went from having our dogs to being practically overwhelmed. So we came to the conclusion that we had something we could give, because we have a vision and a very particular way of understanding this world. But we have a very high degree of certainty that it really helps. And then we decided that the shelter would be funded by all the educational work we did. That we did. So basically, of wolves is the shelter that represents the branch. From the sea, where she comes from, and it's the Canine Education and Rehabilitation Center that she represents.
The bond with dogs is about well-being. We're looking for the simplest equation of well-being. Just like in science, we're looking for the smallest possible equation that answers the maximum number of questions. If the equation or the formula you use to explain reality is too complicated or too big, it usually means in science that you're not close enough, and you need to keep searching. If the equation or formula you use to explain reality is too complicated or too big, well, in science, it usually means that you are not too close or close enough, and that you have to keep looking. If we don't have a clear definition of what canine well-being means, then it's really tough to make decisions to try to achieve it. I understand that there's, let's say, a triangle or a pyramid where emotions lead to behaviors, and a set of behaviors leads to a pattern of behavior. But what supports that pyramid are the neurological states. We try to break down all the answers to the simplest level possible. And once you arrive at an answer that you understand as basic, you start to build a vision so that the foundation is as solid as possible. And we've come to the conclusion that there's nothing more fundamental than neurological states, because the next step is basically physics, quantum physics. That isn't useful for reading the reality of day-to-day life. Our conversation, our methodology, and our mission focus on the hows, not the whys. Everything you can, observe on a macro scale, how it happens on a micro scale. And once you know, or we can explain to you how it happens, the whys suddenly change. It's a why my dog does this, why my dog does that. What's the reason? I'm making a decision so that my dog can achieve the highest possible well-being. And what I would like people to understand is that once the dog reaches the highest level of well-being possible, all the emotions, behaviors, and actions, from there, you don't have to worry about them because they take care of themselves. Everything that happens when someone is well is good. We believe that we've found an objective definition of well-being through neuroscience, from neurology, mechanics, statistics, from physics, from biology, and what we focus on is trying to show, like a roadmap, how to get from where we are to that common well-being. That should really be the goal of anyone sharing their life with a dog. Everything we do is natural. We've never asked a dog to sit. We've never told a dog to lie down. We've never told a dog to walk alongside us. Instead, we're looking for conditioning through obedience. And what happens is that we're in a moment where there's a huge industry of toys, of rewards, collars, harnesses, leashes, mats, activities, which we really don't consider to be directly related to the animal's well-being. We don't use any of that at all. So, there's a huge clash between what we consider the well-being of the dog, the well-being of the human-canine bond, and what has been culturally understood over the last 60 years about the relationship you should have with your dog. So we're at a tricky point, because it's true that there's a huge industry that's completely separate from what we understand, what the relationship between a human and their dog should be. One of the biggest challenges we face every day is that people want solutions to the problems they think they have, and they want those solutions right now. In my experience, we need to understand what the root of the problem really is. We must know where we come from in order to know where we are, and then know where we're headed. In that conversation is a bit longer. Imagine for a moment that we've already reached that ideal scenario where both the human and the dog have achieved the highest possible well-being. Imagine we've drawn a map to reach that ideal place. And the real question is, if you're willing to walk it yourself.
To understand our position in dog training, we first need to grasp the historical context. Where do the most commonly used approaches in the dog world come from? The first thing to know is that the dog training approaches most people are familiar with. They have nothing to do with dogs in their origin, but rather with psychology. And to be more specific, with psychology in the United States. We begin our journey through history in the year 1900, when the field of psychology was completely dominated by the influence of William J. Watson. During this time, psychology had a highly introspective approach and could almost be considered a branch of philosophy. As we will continue to see from here on out, periods of dominance create pendulum swings in thought. And this first shift we're going to look at is no exception. From that absolute dominance of philosophical psychology at the beginning of the 20th century, a diametrically opposed current is born in which new minds want to make it a quantitative and experimental science based on numbers. They understood living beings as a simple system with an input door, the stimuli, and an output door, the behaviors. This emerging discipline within American psychology is known as behaviorism, or in English, behaviorism, and it became the dominant school of thought by the mid-20th century. John B. Watson is known as one of the founding fathers of behaviorism, thanks to publications such as Behavior, an introduction to comparative psychology in 1914, where he describes instinct as a series of reflexes activated by genetic inheritance. And we will definitely have to revisit this definition of instinct later. And in one of the most controversial studies in the history of science, called Little Albert, conducted in 1920, Watson demonstrated that classical conditioning could be used to create a phobia using an 11-month-old baby who had no fears. Prior to the rats, through repeated exposure and association with the sound of a hammer hitting a steel bar, Watson's view of psychology and behavior becomes very clearly defined. Before the rats, through repeated exposure and association with the sound of a hammer hitting a steel bar, Watson's view of psychology and behavior is very well defined. In one of his most famous works, Humans Are Not Born, They Are Made. Give me any child from any background, and I will make him a baker, a builder, or a carpenter. I can turn him into a thief, a killer, or the best friend in the world, since the possibilities of shaping and conditioning behaviors in any direction are almost limitless. B.F. Skinner, a behaviorism leader, developed operant conditioning, showing Skinner, who became one of the most influential figures in American psychology, and whose most important work was probably the theory of operant conditioning in the 1930s, where he argued that behaviors are shaped by their consequences and that positive reinforcement is the most effective way to achieve the desired behavior. And there are three basic principles that govern behaviorism, flagged by John Watson and B.F. Skinner. 1. The notion that all living organisms are blank slates or clean canvases, waiting to be written upon through interaction with the stimuli around us. This implies a total and complete indifference to the genetics and biology of individuals. 2. The theory of reinforcements. If you can control when an organism receives a positive reinforcement or a reward, or a negative reinforcement, a punishment, in the environment around it, you can elicit and get any behavior you want from that organism. 3. The notion of universality. Behaviorism is applicable to all living organisms and species in nature. So, for them it is the same as studying a rat in a lab, as it is to study a tiger in the jungle. And the fact that behaviorism had its golden age in the mid-20th century is of crucial importance in the future of how the vast majority of the population understands their relationship with dogs. Nowadays, when in 1960 there was a surge of dogs in urban areas and an urgent number of families including a dog in their household, the only professional response at that time was training. And training, it's safe to say, is based on conditioning behaviors through reinforcements, both negative and positive. Within behaviorism, there has been one of those pendulum shifts in perception about how to relate to dogs. Until 1998, negative reinforcement was predominant. And after experiencing a rise in dog abandonment, figures like Jim Donaldson make positive reinforcement the new trend in dog training, turning it into a multidimensional industry. And the global impact of this sequence of historical events is understood through the influence of American culture worldwide, through technology, from cinema, music, and television, among others, from the 60s to today. And in the canine application of behaviorism, which is really what we're focusing on, training is synthesized. The world of dogs in John Watson's axiom about humans. A dog isn't born, it's built. And training is used to build the dog you want. This doesn't mean that I have any kind of inherent problem with training, because there are many functional uses for it. And, in fact, I understand that training has its place in both the civilian world and the professional world. and the part of science that made behaviorism an outdated methodology for explaining and understanding the behavior of animals and humans was ethology. Ethology was an emerging discipline that arose in Europe around 1950 to explain and understand the behavior of the animal world. And the well-known founding fathers of ethology, Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and Carl von Frisch, eventually shared the Nobel Prize precisely for creating what we now know as ethology. From its beginnings, ethology has to do with the interaction of an individual's genes with their surrounding environment. And this is summed up in Nico Tinbergen's own definition of ethology, where he says it's the art of interviewing an animal in its original language and in its natural habitat. Broadly speaking, we could say that ethology consists of trying to understand how the internal machinery of an individual's mind works and what it consists of, by experiencing an external stimulus and producing a behavior. And that intermediate step of trying to understand what happens inside the internal mechanism is what completely differentiates ethology from behaviorism. And this is when we are compelled to bring back John Watson's definition. The mind of a living organism is what completely differentiates ethology from behaviorism. And this is when we are compelled to bring back John Watson's definition. What is instinct? Because if you remember, John Watson said that instinct was a series of inherited and genetically activated reflexes. And here the problem comes with the word reflex. Because when you understand that something is a reflex, that implies it can't be changed. Ethology, in turn, dissected what was known as instinct into three different parts. An external stimulus, a fixed action pattern, and the resulting behavior that the external stimulus activates. The fixed action pattern. And a fixed action pattern is a neurological, nerve, and muscular sequence that gets activated when the organism comes into contact with a stimulus. External, and that produces a behavior. But the real big difference between a fixed action pattern and instinct is that the fixed action pattern is sequenced genetically. But the individual has to learn to improve it, contextualize it, and develop it through their life experience. Humans are full of specific fixed action patterns. And among other things, it's the fact that there are action patterns. Fixed, specific patterns for each species. This starts to create a monumental difference with the behavior perspective of behaviorism.
If we talk about humans, for example, nowadays we have the ability to see the fetus inside a mother's womb. And what we've observed is that fetuses have the ability to smile. And the smile is an action pattern. Fixed, it's a fixed action pattern because the fetus hasn't had life experiences yet. Once born, it must learn to adapt that pattern. When it sees mannequins in a window, it shouldn't smile. And what happens is that once Nazca is born, it will have to learn to contextualize, develop, and improve that pattern of action. And when it walks down the street and sees a display window with mannequins on the other side, it shouldn't smile because they won't smile back. And an example that I find compelling and enlightening is that of vervet monkeys, which are native to East Africa. They have three fixed action patterns to activate three different types of alert calls in response to three types of danger. One of them is eagles, another is leopards, and the last one is snakes. These three types of danger come from two different heights, one from the air and the other two from the ground. And what we've noticed when studying vervet monkeys in their natural habitat is that when a young one activates an alert call, the rest of the group doesn't move. They wait for an adult to validate it. It's that when a puppy activates an alert call, the rest of the group doesn't move until there's an adult to validate it. It could be that the switch, which is really a fixed action pattern, has been activated in a way that doesn't match reality. And instead of alerting about a danger from the ground, you do it from the air. And it could be that both a leopard and snakes could eat us. And this is going to be crucial when we translate it to the canine world. Because why? It turns out that due to the excitement of the moment, that young member of the group hasn't activated the correct alert call. We are putting the integrity and lives of the rest of the group at risk. And it's not the result or consequence of negative or positive reinforcements. Because, in nature, most of the time, the first time you make a mistake, you can assume it's a matter of life and death. And when we start to extrapolate all the information and knowledge that comes from ethology to the canine world, we begin to realize what we really have. It's a number of dogs that react disproportionately to the stimuli they face. Dogs that won't stop barking, dogs that keep lunging to attack, dogs that just run away. If a female has had a litter and she herself hasn't had the chance to refine and improve all the fixed internal action patterns, it's going to be impossible for her to do that with her puppies. To refine and improve all the action patterns, fixed internal patterns, it's going to be impossible for her to do that with her puppies. And what if we humans take the puppies away at 3 months? And we also don't have the knowledge or skills to validate all those action patterns. Naturally fixed. What we find is a bunch of switches that turn on and off without any real sense. When the metrics for breeding dogs have been purely aesthetic or based on the abilities to perform activities that we've decided, we've robbed them of the ability to naturally learn, to refine and polish all those action patterns. Fixed. And all the fixed action patterns of dogs come from the animal that evolutionarily preceded them on an earlier rung. Whether it's the gray wolf or an animal that preceded both. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Traditionally, it's been understood that when a dog urinates over another dog's urine, it's doing it to mark its territory. What's really happening is that there's a pattern of action. For sure, I remember, it's a neurological, nervous, and muscular sequence that gets activated when a dog smells another dog's urine. Fixed action patterns help wild animals survive. In today's dogs, it lacks meaning. It has a connotation and a valencia. Both evolutionary and adaptive as well as survival, because it is delayed communication. But in today's dogs, it does not have the same meaning. What I'm trying to tell you with this is that your dog is not urinating on another dog's urine to mark territory. It's just a switch that gets flipped when it interacts with that stimulus. It's much more important to focus right now on how things happen that you can observe on a macro scale than on the why. Why do they happen? Everything we've seen so far has to do with how the internal machinery of an individual's body works. We're trying to dilute the conversation to see how far we can read, just with zeros and ones. We're not talking about consciousness. We're not talking about souls. We're not talking about emotions yet.
Hey, Alberto. Can't we make all of this a little easier so everyone can understand it? A quick summary to make everything clearer for you.
We always have the same conversation. But in the end, you know what we're trying to do. This is a series. Educational. This is more of an outreach program in education than a show where we're just seeing how good we are at it. An education than a program where we're just seeing how good we are at it. Dogs. I think the tone there, if we're presenting facts, if we're providing information, has to be seriously serious so that people can learn the concepts.
Yeah, that's clear. But there are people who also mention it in the comments. Aside from everything you say and all the explanations you give, making each video a summary to make the concepts clear for people. For example, I was reading a comment. It would be great if you could make a video, a 5-minute summary with the most important points. There are a lot of people who don't have the capacity to understand all the concepts you explain.
It might be that sometimes I get a bit too caught up in the rhetoric, and maybe it's true that I should make it easier. for people who aren't that interested or people who are used to other formats that are a bit simpler to try. A little simpler to try. Behaviorism in training. Reinforcing both negatively with a punishment and positively. With a reward, you can get the behavior you want of any animal. And that's true, but it has nothing to do with well-being. And people, to me, I would like them to understand that it's okay to do activities and it's okay to do training, but that are based on something that has been scientifically discredited for a long time. And what are the implications of that? That means all the studies, for example, nowadays, in the current legislation in Spain. Nowadays, it's based on one of the versions of behaviorism, which is positive reinforcement. That's great, but it has nothing to do with achieving or how to achieve well-being in dogs. So, that would be the easiest way I could sum up the whole part about behaviorism. That we've done.
Can you possibly give a brief summary?
I would tell you that, like behaviorism, it's also a discipline within science that arises to try to explain animal behavior that have nothing to do with behaviorism, which, in fact, is the branch of science that ends with behaviorism, but it also doesn't talk about well-being. It doesn't give you tools or help you understand the animal's well-being either. It's focused on trying to understand behavior and how it happens. And among the best, what has been a bit denser, and the word I've repeated 200 times in the last 10 minutes is action pattern, for sure. What I would like people to understand is basically that they are switches. Switches that activate a behavior that you have genetically coded, according to your species. And once you know how to read or interpret those action patterns, for sure, those switches, you realize that there are many questions within animal behavior and conduct that don't need to be searched for anymore. What? Have you been paying attention?
Thank you. Can we go back and finish the episode like we had planned?
We can.
At this point, we need to contextualize and put into perspective everything we've seen so far regarding behaviorism. Because there are two realities that coexist parallelly, and we need to be able to differentiate them because both are true. At the same time, behaviorism is a scientific method to explain and understand the behavior and conduct of both animals and humans has been completely discredited for years. 50. But that's the reality, and it shows the possibilities that conditioning through positive and negative reinforcement allows you to shape behaviors to achieve the desired outcome. And while Ethology has provided us with a lot of valuable information to continue our journey, it also doesn't address the welfare of the individual. It also doesn't talk about the welfare of the dog. He's still talking about behaviors and conduct. And this forces us to keep moving forward in our pursuit of the welfare of the human-dog bond.